So hello and welcome to everyone who has joined the Memo Live conversation. My name is Charlene Boumansour. I'm a journalist at Middle East Monitor, and today I'll be speaking to a very special guest, Lebanese journalist and editor of the award-winning book, Are Women on the Ground, Zahra Hankir. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me today, Charlene. I really appreciate it.
So I want to talk about your book, which I have actually. It's right here. It features essays of Arab women reporting from the Middle East. But after the Beirut blast on the 4th of August, you found yourself on the ground. What was it like to go from editing the essays of others to being the one there? And what stories stuck out to you the most?
Thank you for asking me this question. It's something that I actually thought about a lot because part of the editing process for that book involved dealing with some of the trauma that the women had seen and endured themselves while on the ground. And a lot of these women had been reporting from conflict zones such as Syria and Iraq, or reporting on societal upheaval such as in Egypt. And I felt at times that I was a little bit of a fraud, to be quite honest, because I was dealing with women who were doing reporting on the ground whilst at a distance myself. I was editing this book from, my basement flat in Hackney. I've been very privileged with my reporting. I have done on the ground reporting before, specifically in Lebanon, but it had been a long while, I think about 10 years since I had done the type of reporting I did this time around, which involved going to Karantina, which is a deprived neighborhood just on the outskirts of the port, or just basically adjacent to the port, I would say. And I spent about 2 weeks there in the aftermath of the blast, speaking to victims about their experiences of the blast and how they were coping with the loss of livelihoods, the loss of homes, the loss of loved ones. And there was a lot of trauma there. And I found the experience to be extremely profound, extremely enlightening, in the sense that so many of these people had felt so deprived even prior to the blast and so ignored even prior to the blast. And then when they were having to deal with survival in the way that they were forced to, what they really needed was, besides the actual support of rebuilding their homes, they really needed emotional support and mental health support as well. And for that reason, so many of the people that I spoke to just wanted to speak and just wanted to be listened to and wanted to share their sadness and their fears and the profound shock that they experienced. And as a result of that, I feel that I learned a lot more about minorities in Lebanon and their experiences, about people of, let's say, a lower socioeconomic status and their experiences. And also that Lebanon is enduring a profound mental health crisis in this particular moment. I wouldn't even call it post-traumatic stress disorder, because they're very much living in the trauma and living with the anxiety of what they've been experiencing. So it was very humbling and very eye-opening in that sense.
Yeah, and how would you say, so I kind of want to talk a bit about Lebanon's politics. So it's often characterized as being based around sect, tribal, ethnic affiliation. How do you think the events over the past year and post-blast specifically has changed or impacted people's political opinions? Do you feel like there have been any shifts or changes?
I definitely think with the October Revolution, there was a sense of unity when it came to agreeing that there needed to be a shakeup in the sectarian political configuration of the country. We know this through slogans that were used, Killun yani Killun, we need to get rid of all of the political elite in the country because of the corruption and the impunity that they had enjoyed over the years that led the country, or dragged the country, into this economic and humanitarian crisis. And my feeling, particularly then, because I did spend some time in Lebanon a year ago, was that there was hope that there could be profound change and long-lasting change, especially when Saad Hariri was forced to step down. I think with the aftermath of the blast, there was an element of anger and not fear, I would say anger, that I hadn't seen before. I arrived to Lebanon 2 or 3 days after the blast, spent some time in quarantine, and then was able to spend time also on the ground with the protesters when they initially protested. And I have never seen that level of anger in Lebanon before. And I think the idea that we need to get rid of the political elite very much remain, but I also think that there's sort of an underbelly of sectarianism that remains with particular groups who send out their very loyal party members, and that also caused some friction on the ground. And we actually saw some clashes in Khaldi. You would have heard of those clashes as well. So while I think this feeling of, killun yani killun, they all need to go, persists and prevails, and that the anger against the political elite has increased, we actually see it very much on television, where you have people cursing political parties that they would never curse before, or specific political figures. I would say that at the same time, you do have this sort of friction between people who still very much adhere to sectarian party politics. And even if they're in a minority, they're still made to be very visible. I actually don't know if they're in a minority. I'm just saying, even let's assume that they were, they're still made to be very visible when they're sent to the streets. So there's the friction there, and the push and pull of sort of sectarian politics over having a new political configuration. And sadly, as we've seen with developments over the past few weeks, the country or the government or the political elite are not willing to budge on that sectarian political configuration. And Saad Hariri, as we've seen, is back in the very spot that he had resigned from a year ago. So I think when you have this political elite that's very much entrenched in the system, it leads to this sort of feeling of helplessness. Like, as much as we do, even if we go to the ground and we spend days screaming for change, that at the end of the day, there are things out of our control, there are factors out of our control. And that's, I think, profoundly tragic.
Yeah. What stories stuck out to you the most? Like, was there something that you just feel like, people need to hear about this?
Yeah, I would definitely say it was the Syrian refugee community, and how they were treated in the aftermath of the blast. I think they received, at least in Karantina, based on the dozens of people that I interviewed, they were receiving less attention than others. They were facing some discrimination. Some of these people were living in really already quite destitute homes, really just like a room with no resources at all. And suddenly they find themselves completely homeless and are sleeping on mattresses on the street. And yet we're not getting the attention that aid organizations were giving to Lebanese who lived in the same area. And I say this from really what I witnessed and from the people that I spoke to. I spoke to, for example, a Syrian man in his 60s who the authorities were sort of hounding him because he was living in a room that sort of was like an informal arrangement with the owner of that room. And he was being, asked, do you have paperwork to live here? What are you doing here? And there was nothing left. In that moment, actually, when the authorities were questioning him, I was there, and he was standing in front of rubble, literal rubble. And he was being questioned in that way. And I could see the discrimination right in front of me, and also how he was reacting to it, which was, it's just so sad to see. And then another Syrian refugee family in which the man, Musa, who is in his 20s, actually said to me, I am experiencing discrimination. Nobody wants to talk about this, but I have had no help whatsoever. He was also in a home that was falling apart, and his wife was pregnant and he had a child. On the upside of that, when I did share some of these stories, some very generous donors stepped forward, as did some organizations, which I thought was really encouraging. But from the onset, this idea that there is a discrepancy in the different communities who receive aid was very, very visible to me. And the fact that the Syrian refugee community was getting less attention than Lebanese who lived in these deprived areas was also very visible to me. So that definitely stayed with me.
Yeah, which is really devastating. So something that we were actually talking about previously was that there's a record number of people who want to leave Lebanon. They're desperate. So we've seen people from Tripoli risk their lives trying to reach Europe by boat. And some of the stories are just heartbreaking. What do you believe was the tipping point that made people so desperate to escape?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring this up because I actually have been speaking and in very close touch with one of the people who tried to flee Lebanon. He's a fisherman, divorced with children, and he could no longer afford to support the family in any way. He couldn't put food on the table consistently. He felt that he had no support from the state, especially with the blast. As soon as the blast happened, he felt that this was the tipping point. On the day of the blast, he met up with several people in the community, and they decided that they were going to pool money into buying a boat, and that they would get on that boat, and that this fisherman would take them to Cyprus. They would leave from the port of Tripoli and take them to Cyprus, and then from there that they would go to Italy. And they had spent weeks buying food supplies for the boat. And it wasn't just Lebanese, they had some Syrians with them as well. And, his explanation was there's just no prospects. There's no room for dreams. There's no room for ambition in Lebanon. I have to make a change. If I'm to provide for my family in the long term, I have to go to a European country. I have to find work there, and I have to then bring my family over. So he left on the boat. He didn't take his family with him. He left them in Lebanon because the idea was he would go and start anew, and then once he's settled, he'd bring them over. But then they were intercepted in Cyprus and forcefully returned to Lebanon. And he's in a profound state of depression and desperation right now because he feels, he couldn't even succeed at leaving. He's so desperate. All he wants to do is leave, but he doesn't have the same privileges that some people with, let's say, foreign passports or relatives in different countries have. So really the key word here is desperation, rooted in the economic situation. People, half of the Lebanese population is living under the poverty line. The outlook doesn't look good, especially as the government prepares to end subsidies on basic goods. And I can see why, even professionals would want to leave Lebanon, but more so the underprivileged communities that really don't see any hope at all in the country. And this man really, he said something so vivid to me. He said, he'd gotten on the boat and as he just looked back at Lebanon, as they were drifting away, he just said, I never, ever want to come back. And he was so certain about that. And he was hopeful about what was to come. And actually, when they were intercepted in Cyprus and forced to come back, a couple of people who were on the boat with them threw themselves in the water and tried to swim to the shore. That's how desperate they were. Of course, they couldn't make it and they had to be picked up. But yeah, it's rooted in profound desperation.
Yeah, it's like phrases that you would hear. It's like, I will take this risk. I don't even mind, dying as long as I take this step and try and escape, which is really sad. How do you feel that the journalists covering Lebanon have been impacted, especially over this past year?
Just on the note of dying, I did want to say also that he said something that I've heard a lot, which is that people are already dying a slow death in Lebanon. So the risk of death it's not enough to keep them from going, which is tragic. In terms of journalists, that's a very good question. A lot of my friends are journalists on the ground. There's a lot of trauma there because many of these journalists experienced the blast themselves, and they were reporting on the tragedy of the blast. And this actually echoes some of what is in my book, Our Women on the Ground, which is that with local reporters, or let's say in this context, Lebanese reporters, or let's say Syrians or Arab reporters who settled in Lebanon, the stakes feel so much higher because the story is so profoundly personal for them. So without naming this journalist, one of my journalist friends, had a relative in hospital at the time that the journalist was reporting on this crisis. And another one of my friends was injured. She was a journalist and she continued to report. And they tried to keep the emotions. And when I say they, I include myself too. I didn't experience the blast, but I certainly experienced the emotions associated with sort of loss and grief. You try to keep your emotions at bay to do your job. But it's so difficult to do so because what you're witnessing is the disintegration of your own country and by extension, your identity in a way, and you're witnessing it in slow motion. And even, for example, reporting on the economic crisis in the country, like that is something that everyone in Lebanon is experiencing. Like my family, my parents, my father's car was stolen. Like people are so desperate that there's been like a spate in car theft. People are eating differently. My family for a while were not eating meat. People have adjusted the way they live. They've adjusted the medication they're taking because there's sort of a lack of medication in some pharmacies. And it's that sort of immediate impact that is so profoundly personal that has an impact on how you approach the story. It kind of trickles through, right? Initially, I was just focused on the work, which I think many journalists have done without really reflecting on how I felt about it. I think now that I've left Lebanon, I'm currently in New York and I have a little bit of distance. It definitely hit me. I felt real profound sadness and anxiety just thinking about what had happened in the country. And especially now that the news cycle has moved on, it also feels just so sad to see that there's sort of less attention on Lebanon now. And it almost feels like this like lost cause, but the tragedy and the trauma is very much persisting in the country. So it's really a mix of emotions. I think it's being committed to doing your job and wanting to raise awareness and to be authentic and to tell the stories of what people are experiencing on the ground. But it's also an attempt to keep your head above the water and to not get too emotionally invested. I definitely got emotionally invested with some of the survivors that I spoke to. I still have multiple WhatsApp messages from them on a day-to-day basis. I try to help them, but at the same time, I also think there needs to be some distance there because they need professional help. So it's hard to have that line. And, one of the examples of my book is the essay by Noor Malas, where she very much talks about her experience as a Syrian reporter reporting on the civil war in Syria, where the stakes are much higher and it's a very personal battle or struggle to remain impartial while you're reporting on these tragic developments. So thank you for asking that question. I think sort of addressing the trauma that journalists face is very important. And I think sharing the trauma as well is important, whether it's the trauma of the people you're reporting on or the vicarious trauma that you might be feeling yourself. And my book very much echoes that.
Yeah. And this was a question actually that I was asking while I was out there. Lebanese people are known to be resilient, but I want to know your opinion. Does Lebanon have any hope? Do you have any hope in Lebanon's future? I mean, it's really sad to be asking that kind of question, but yeah.
I mean, the resilient narrative is one that has been heavily questioned, as I'm sure you're aware of, because it kind of presumes that, well, we can keep taking this trauma. We're strong enough to get through this. We will rise like the phoenix, we'll come out of the ashes. And I think that people have discredited that because really what's resilient in Lebanon is the political elite. They're the ones who have been able to continue perpetuating systematic oppression on the people of Lebanon. And in terms of whether or not I have hope, that's a very difficult question because I think I have hope, I would say, in particular pockets of society who are very much committed to helping people out on the ground. I would say civil society, in particular groups like Embrace, for example, which focuses on mental health, people who work for the Lebanese Red Cross, the ICRC. There's so many fantastic local Lebanese organizations that do brilliant work. One of them is called Haven for Artists. They sheltered people in the aftermath of the blast. They did things like art therapy. They offered free mental health sessions. So, groups like these or the youth that still go to the ground and protest give me hope because it's people banding together for the greater good of society and saying, well, if the government is not going to do this, we are going to step in and we're going to step up and we're not going to be entirely crushed. And that's not about a narrative around resilience. That's about survival. You need to work on survival on the day-to-day, and people are very much doing that. I also witnessed a lot of kindness from Lebanese people who, particularly in my reporting, who stepped up to help some of the people who I reported on. I had no shortage of messages from people who wanted to donate individually to some of the victims of the blast. So those elements give me hope. if you're going to ask me about the greater political configuration and system in the country, I don't have any hope. And that's just, it's brutally honest, that I just don't see how anything in the immediate term can change. And if there were to be greater change, there would need to be a shakeup on a very drastic level that I don't think would come easily. And I can't even imagine how it might come about. So I think macro, don't have much hope, but I would say micro, if you're looking on the ground and the people, the work that they're doing on the ground, I definitely have hope in the strength and the survival techniques and strategies of the youth, and not necessarily just the youth. There are many Lebanese across all generations and sects who are working together in the absence of the government and government help, and that gives me hope in some ways.
So you were there during the protests of the 17th of October of this year, marking the 1-year anniversary. How was it different to the previous protests?
Yeah, it's difficult to capture. It was a very intense experience because I think a year ago, there was so much hope. It was so electric. There's this beautiful essay written by Lina Monzir for a new publication called New Lines, in which she said it's almost like, you know, like a love, like a profound love that you experience, and the excitement and the electricity around that, and then sort of grieving its loss in the aftermath of that. And I think that the protests of October 17 this year, there was, while the energy was still there, there was still a sense of loss. It's almost like you're trying to recapture the hope that was there a year ago, with the knowledge that things have only deteriorated over the past 12 months. So in truth, for me personally, it felt sad. It felt sad. I loved and I appreciated there were still so many people out there. People were still dancing. There were still ergile. There was still, you know, great singing and music, and sort of there was some attempt to regenerate the same feeling that there was a year ago, but it just wasn't quite the same. And I think that's because there is a very profound awareness that these greater political forces continue to weigh so heavily on the country, to the extent that everything there feels in a way like it's falling apart. And that's really profoundly sad. So that was my personal feeling, and perhaps it's a negative reading, but it's personally what I felt. It just didn't quite feel the same.
Definitely, yeah. Those who travel to Lebanon have all said the same thing regularly. They all say that this year, traveling to Lebanon felt extremely different. I just hope that things start to improve and not deteriorate even more. But Zahra, thank you very much for speaking to me today, and I wish you all the best in everything that you do. Thank you for raising awareness, and thanks to everyone who's joined us on the Memo Live conversation today.
Thank you, Charlene, for all the great work that you're doing as well. Really appreciate you having me. Thank you.
No problem. And you could tune in next Wednesday for another Memo Live conversation with a new guest. Zahra, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.